we're live. Hi, and welcome to Read Reviews, the podcast where we talk about a variety of books from a Marxist and anarchist perspective. And I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Thanks for having me, Corey. Very excited about our podcast episode tonight. I always think about how we end the season. You know, this is our last episode of the season, and I always think about, okay, how do we end it with a bang? And I always feel very strongly that you sort of save the best for the last. And so tonight is a book I've been wanting to do since we started the show. I don't know why we haven't done it until now. I think it was mainly just because I think there were other interesting things that kept pushing it farther and farther down the queue.
Yeah, I think it's always been in the list, right?
It's always been in the list. It's always been in the list, and it ends up getting moved for other things. Yeah. But so I'm finally glad that we're doing it tonight, especially because I think, we're after the elections. It looks like the French government is pretty much collapsing. The German government is pretty much collapsing. And come January, the American government might be collapsing. So we look at it, we live in an era in which it feels like everything is constantly happening, but nothing changes. No one is bored, but everything is boring.
Yeah, for sure.
And I like these kinds of phrases, because they get to the heart of what it's like to live in the early 21st century. And to me, there's really no better guide to understanding what it's like to live in the early 21st century under capitalism than Mark Fisher.
Right.
So Mark Fisher is a big part of why I sort of came back to the left after many years of sort of political meandering, where I was a libertarian for a number of years in college, and then I sort of became I was a liberal for many, many years, and sort of centrist liberal. And, it was really sort of opening my mind to different things that got me to Mark Fisher. So it was basically, I've talked a lot about the influence of Michael Brooks on me, and the late great Michael Brooks, the broadcaster and author. And through him, I just started to learn a lot about broader left theory and getting a sense of the stuff that I should have been reading in my 20s that I wasn't, or stuff that I should have been reading in my early 20s that I didn't get to until my late 20s.
Right.
And Mark Fisher was one of those. So before we get into more of the details, so tonight's book is Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher, published by Zero Books in 2009. Zero Books was the book company that Mark Fisher helped co-create. Zero Books was around for many, many years. It was, I think, just purchased a year or two ago and is kind of defunct. The Zero Books imprint still exists, and the books that were published under the Zero Books imprint are still around, but they're not publishing any new books. That's for the other book company that Mark Fisher set up called Repeater Books, which is still around.
Okay.
So Mark Fisher, I think that I would argue that Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher is arguably probably one of the most, if not the most influential texts of left theory in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I think that for a lot of people, their understanding of what it's like to live under capitalism and reading something that opened their mind to seeing the world very differently for a lot of people, it starts with Mark Fisher. Yeah. I often think that if we could start the world, the world would be a lot different if we could start out young college students with copies of Capitalist Realism rather than copies of Atlas Shrugged. I feel like we would be in a much better world.
Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell.
Or Thomas Sowell, or Economics One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, right?
Yeah.
The world would be a lot better if we, open your mind to how the world actually works.
Yeah.
Instead of how people think it does. So who was Mark Fisher? Mark Fisher was an author. He was a lecturer. He received a PhD in philosophy. He was a philosopher. He wrote a lot about the intersections of politics, philosophy, and culture, specifically music. He wrote a lot about music. He was in a band in his youth, and then was very influenced by the post-punk era that came out of bands, say, like Joy Division, and The Fall. These bands sort of came out in 79, 80, 81, 82, but they really felt like they were light years ahead of where everybody else was, and kind of spoke to what the future was going to be. I think there's a sense in which you can kind of listen to Joy Division and listen to it today, and it still feels very fresh and
Right.
and poignant and powerful. And Mark Fisher's writing is a lot like that, where he still resonates with you. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, he was a truly gifted writer and thinker, but also, unfortunately, not a lot has happened in the 15 years between the publication of Capitalist Realism and today. He is someone who struggled his entire life with depression.
Okay.
And he wrote about it very beautifully in other books like Ghost of My Life, which the essay we're going to be talking about in the post game comes from that book. And he sadly took his own life in 2017 after years of sort of dealing with it and writing very poignantly about it. His loss, I think, for a lot of people was just unfathomable, because he was only 50 when he died.
Yeah, I
He
think
had years ahead of
he was
him.
roughly 10 years older than I am.
Yeah.
So
he was, and the thing was, he was in the middle of finishing another book, which was called Acid Communism. That was what the book he was going to end up writing, and he started to write part of it, and never finished it. But Fisher was someone who I think really spoke, and still does, to the situation that we're in the world, which is that why doesn't it feel like anything is getting better? Why does it feel like nothing changes? Why does it feel like everything kind of sucks?
Yep.
And I think he speaks to that in a way that a lot of other writers can, but don't do with as much sort of frenetic energy and ability to transcend some of the more niche audiences of books, right? Not everybody's going to read Zizek. Not everybody's going to read a Frederick Jameson book. But I guarantee you, most people, if they think of books of left theory to read, Capitalist Realism's on that list.
Yeah.
To me, it's like essential reading. If you were to say, what are the 5 books that you should read to think about what it's like to be a leftist? Capitalist Realism is to me, it's like Communist Manifesto, and then State and Revolution, and then boom. For me, it's those 3, and then Capitalist Realism. The book, I read it for the first time in 2018, 2019, somewhere around that. And I remember it just hit me like a freight train. I was like, oh my God, finally, a book that speaks to the era in which I live, that is just kind of cutting through the nonsense and the noise. And it felt very liberatory to experience a book that spoke to my own concerns about the world and understood why we're in the place that we are. And so it's a short book, but it's very powerful. It's about 100 pages, but it fits a lot into that. And
I think when I listened to it, I was surprised at how short it was because I basically listened to it in one night at work, and it was over before I thought about it. I was like, that was too fast. I got to re-listen to that sometime.
If you do the audiobook, it's like 3.5 hours or something.
Yeah, it's fast.
You can read it in a day. You can sit with it. The thing that, and I love short books. Long books are fun, but I love short books. I love authors that are able to do something with succinct language. And so, what is capitalist realism? What does that mean? What is that notion? And I think that for us, the way to describe it is the phrase that I think a lot of people know. I think even one of your guests at one point said it at one point, which is that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
Which is a quote that's attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek. So who are those two guys? Because they feature quite prominently in the book, right?
Right.
Fisher's book is a really great popularization of cultural and political theory of the last 30, 40 years. Now, clearly, he's influenced by the Frankfurt School. There are hints of Adorno there. There's hints of Walter Benjamin there. It's all there. Doesn't even if he doesn't cite them directly.
Right.
But the people he cites a lot are Jameson and Zizek. Jameson, of course, who recently just passed away this year. He was in his 90s. Probably at the time before his death, the greatest living Marxist literary critic in the world. And then Slavoj Žižek is the Slovenian philosopher and cultural critic who
extremely well known.
It's extremely well known. Most people may not know who Jameson is, but they know who Žižek is.
Yeah.
And what's funny is the reason the quote's attributed to both of them is because neither one of them can figure out who said it first. So it was basically like we're thinking about this or whatever. But then Fisher goes on to actually define what capitalist realism is in the book. He says that this slogan, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. That slogan, this is Fisher, captures precisely what I mean by capitalist realism, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. So and it's more than just the economic system, because we've talked a lot about neoliberalism on the podcast. I think this episode would be a good pair with the episode we did on neoliberalism with David Harvey's book. David Harvey's also cited the book too. But he also talks about it just sort of this background noise that fits over everything. And the interesting thing for me is that, we live in a time now where the past is kind of gone. It's done, but so is the future, that there's really no future.
Right.
And I always think of the song, Pretty Vacant. I think it's Pretty Vacant by the Sex Pistols. The last line of that song is no future for me, no future for you. Right.
Right.
It's that sense of that nothing is going to get better. And people have sort of resigned themselves to the fact that today kind of sucks and tomorrow will probably be worse, which is the complete opposite of the sort of Steven Pinker, Hans Rosling view of the world, which is that today is the greatest day the human race has ever had and tomorrow will be better. Fisher is basically saying no. Today's pretty fucking bad and tomorrow is likely going to be worse.
Right.
And so he opens with discussing the film Children of Men.
Okay.
Which is based on the novel by P.D. James. P.D. James, who mostly wrote and writes detective fiction, but wrote one or two books of speculative fiction or science fiction, and one of them was The Children of Men, which was made a movie. And in that movie, the premise is that basically something has happened in the world and women can no longer bear children. And so the last person to ever have been born was born in the year 1995. And so in order to sort of keep the world sane, there's this sort of autocracy that fits over the world. And this takes place in Britain. So there's a scene in the movie where they go to Battersea Station, which is the iconic building in England with, it's on the cover of Pink Floyd's Animals. It's in a bunch of shit where it's the tube, the smokestacks, and the Battersea Power Station. That's been converted into a museum of humanity where it has the Mona Lisa and painting by Van Gogh and all this kind of stuff, this culture stuff. And and the question that's often asked is, why are we preserving any of this if there's no future for humanity, period?
Right.
If everybody's going to die out and humanity's going to go extinct, what's the point of this? And I think what's interesting is that he describes the movie as not something that's sort of waiting down the road, or something that's already happened. He describes it as being lived through. There's no punctual moment of disaster, as he writes. The world doesn't end with a bang. It winks out, unravels, gradually falls apart. Yes. This is the people expect the end of the human race to be this sort of grand thing.
Right.
No.
It's not an asteroid hitting us.
No, it's not an asteroid hitting us. It's this slow process of everything gradually getting worse and no one doing anything about it.
Yeah.
And so that sort of sense that nothing will get better kind of permeates capitalist realism. And because capitalism is very plastic, it's very plastic. It can change and mold, as we've talked about before. It's a lot harder to get rid of capitalism than we conceived of, or at least as Marx conceived of, or or somebody like Bakunin conceived of. It's a lot harder to think of it because capitalism doesn't really have any core, weirdly enough, doesn't have like ideological commitments in, say, the way that even hard right ideologies do. Like capitalism often butts heads even with fascism, in the sense that because fascism has very specific political and social commitments that actually would undermine capitalism as an economic mode. Same with socialism or communism. But capitalism, because it doesn't particularly like care what people believe, it doesn't really, because it keeps going on.
Yep.
That
very specifically really doesn't care what people believe, right?
No, it can't, right? It
has to adapt so that the profit motive keeps going.
Yep. And so I kind of wrote in my notes, I was like, getting people to recognize this plasticity about capitalism is one of, I think, the first steps to acknowledging the way to get over it.
Yeah.
Because we live in constant crisis. That's what I meant earlier when I was saying everything is happening, but nothing changes, in the sense that we move from crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis, and yet everything kind of stays the same.
Yeah.
The crisis of 2008, the crisis of the Eurozone after the crash of 2008, 2009, the election of far right leaders, Brexit, Trump, Viktor Orban, and then COVID. Right, COVID's like the big example of like how everything changes. Or everything happens, but nothing changes, right? So it's like that was an opportunity, a sort of once in a century opportunity to really solidify social democratic policy for generations. And it just didn't happen. It was pretty much removed overnight, and everything had to go back to the way it was before. So even a horrific crisis that left over 1 million people in the United States dead, millions dead around the world, didn't change the world.
Yeah.
It didn't make it, it didn't really make it better. If anything, it made it worse. So there's that sense in which nothing happens and nothing changes. And so how does capitalist realism become the main thing? Well, it's the story of neoliberalism, right? It's the story of, in the 1970s, worker power was probably as strong around the world as it ever was.
Yeah.
And you had leaders like Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the US, but also before him, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter really was the first neoliberal president. Jimmy Carter, what Reagan was doing was just what Carter was doing on steroids. And then what Clinton would do was what Reagan did on steroids. So it's like, it's a long history. But basically Thatcher's doctrine was this idea that there is no alternative, Tina, that there is no alternative to capitalism. This is the best it's ever going to be. And in many ways, for a while there, that Reagan and Thatcher were sort of vindicated by history, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union within a matter of 2 years.
Right.
There was a real sense that we really had reached what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history.
Yeah.
That the sort of liberal democracies and capitalism was the dominant mode of economic and political organization. It was the only one that works until it doesn't. And I think that's the thing that people don't realize is, even as we talk, right, we talk about the problems of capitalism. Well, everybody will always say, well, what would you rather live under? Would you rather live under like communism or whatever?
Literally fucking anything else. Sorry.
Literally anything else. I think other than fascism, which I wouldn't want to live under fascism.
That's right. Yeah,
I think anything else would be better than what we have now. Like a sort of the post-war social democratic liberalism of, say, the United States, or the sort of post-war labor government in Britain, right? These broader social democratic programs. I'd love to live under that. In many ways, it was a much more progressive time than the one we live under now. And so there's this constant divide between what policy actually is and what capitalism actually does versus what people think it does, or they believe that it does.
Right.
And we talked about that in our episode. We talked about vulture capitalism, where there's like the story we tell ourselves about capitalism and the market, free markets and all that shit. In reality, it's not really like that. There's a tremendous amount of planning and force that's involved to keep this all going. And the problem for all of this is not only is this bad for politics, but it's bad for culture. So, he has a section where he's describing Kurt Cobain and Nirvana.
Okay.
And it's sort of building on what Frederick Jameson was writing about. Frederick Jameson wrote a very iconic book in the end of the 80s or early 90s called Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. I have it on the shelf over there. We will probably do that book at some point, because I think to understand capitalist realism, you have to understand that book. And that's a book we have to really, to get a sense of where Fisher's pulling some of this from, it's from Jameson. In the sense that when Jameson's talking about how with the emergence of postmodernism, modernism breaks down. And, as described by, I think, Lyotard or another French theorist, is like the breakdown of meta-narratives, right? So when we think about Marxism is a very modernist philosophy. Right. In the sense that it's building in successive stages to get to an endpoint, which is communism. Right. Anarchism is a very modernist viewpoint. Yeah. It's the same thing. It's getting there differently than, say, Marx. It's Marx has more of a sort of a different view of the state than anarchism.
Yeah, at least until you get to a certain point with anarchism, because then there was like a bunch of postmodernist stuff and like the
bingo
Dadaists or whatever they were.
Yes, I would like to call those the performative anarchists. To me, there's a certain form of anarchism that people don't like, and it's the one that tends to get the more cultural attention. Right. Which sort of, I like to call it like anarchism TM, where it's sort of like, fuck the system, man. I don't want, it's a very superficial, childish, infantile kind of way of looking at the world. Whereas anarchism is not. Anarchism is not an infantile way of looking at the world. It's one that's deeply informed by history and economics and science and history. Yeah. And it very much understands that you can't just say, fuck the state, although I agree with that. But why do we say that, and how do we get beyond it? Because that's really because that's the thing, I think, why reading Fisher is important. Is it's important to recognize, and it's also why David Graeber is important to read too, and why Graeber and Fisher kind of go well together, interestingly enough, I think, is that Graeber constantly talks about like, none of this is natural. Yeah. The way that capitalist realism is sold to us is that it's like the wind and the tides. Like this is just how it is. There is no alternative. Like this is how it's going to be. When in reality, these are very deliberate choices made specifically by people in positions of power who shape policy deliberately. It's not something that they just sort of, they sort of move with it. That's right. They make policy, and it can easily be unmade.
It's not an actual force of nature. Yeah.
Yeah. So to get back to the Cobain part, right. The challenge that Cobain was finding in his own life was this idea that, Cobain found himself, and this is me quoting the book, in a world in which stylistic innovation is no longer possible, where all that is left is to imitate dead styles. To speak through the masks and with the voices of the styles of the imaginary museum. That's in reference to the Children of Men. And so here even success meant failure, in the sense that, to me, grunge was kind of the last thing where people could hear it and go, wow, that's like new.
That's different.
A thing. Yeah. This is different. And I don't think there's anything that comes out now that has that same cultural cachet. Right. I just don't think so. And maybe I'm limited because I don't know as much about hip hop. To me, it seems like hip hop of the last 20 years is that, like, it's doing that, but again, hip hop was by its very definition postmodern, in the sense that it was constantly pulling from all of these other different things.
Right. Yeah. Like even the sampling and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah. There was never a cohesion to it in the way that there was in specific styles of, But I guess you could say things like trap music or whatever, kind of like you could imagine trap music 20 years ago. But I'm thinking like, actually, yeah, you could. But it's, but today's music is mostly a pastiche that's informed by other previous music. But this is where you can also get at the idea that, but wasn't Nirvana also just a conglomeration of influences of their time? Like, you can listen to Nirvana, and to me, especially if you listen to Nevermind, like the biggest influence I hear on Nevermind is the Beatles. It's like the Beatles and the Pixies. It's like those two, right?
Yeah.
The Beatles in terms of like songwriting and in terms of creating really catchy songs that are not infantile, that aren't stupid. Interestingly enough, when they were making Nevermind, Butch Vig, who was the producer, recommended to Kurt Cobain, hey, this song would sound better if we double tracked your voice.
Okay.
And he's like, I don't know feel about that. It feels superficial to me. I don't know. And the way that Butch Vig sold it to him was, John and Paul did that on Beatle records.
Okay.
And Kurt Cobain was like, okay. And back in the day, when the Beatles would do double tracking of the vocals, they wouldn't just redub the original take. They would record two different versions and sync them.
Yeah.
They would do one, and then they would sing along with the other one. A good example of this is Eleanor Rigby, which is one of the best Beatles songs. If you listen to it, Paul's voice is double tracked on that song,
right?
But it's two separate takes
That's
put
crazy.
together.
That's crazy.
So if you listen to it really carefully, you'll find fuck ups with it,
for sure.
Which makes it really charming and like nice.
Yeah.
In a way that music today, it's like you could just record the vocal track and Pro Tools, just copy paste, done. Even back then, Nirvana, they recorded it still on tape, right? Like, so you would have to do the dub of that take and then loop that into the master track. Like, you couldn't just do it very easily. What's interesting to me is that, and this is something that Fisher kind of hits on indirectly, but it's something I care about a lot, is that we live in an era that is very frictionless, where it's very easy to just do stuff.
Yeah.
And I think as a result, it's been bad for culture. So, for example, Citizen Kane, probably one of the greatest movies ever made, came out in 1941. So it's a movie that's 83 years old. There are things in that movie that look incredible. And you think to yourself, how did they do this? They had to sit down and figure it out.
Yeah.
Because there weren't computers back then. So they had to figure out how to do all these really interesting things.
Yeah.
Whether it's how to film Orson Welles standing in front of this giant wall of mirrors without cameras being there. It was all these different tricks that they figured out, or like splitting a table in half and having the camera go through the table to achieve a shot. Like all this really creative, interesting things. They don't have to do that anymore.
No, that's right.
It's all CGI. And so it's very easy. That's why I have a yeah.
I was just thinking, like, even early CGI took like effort and like work, and like they had to figure it out. But then you go like, now they've got this Coca-Cola commercial that was made with AI or whatever, and it's like, oh my god! So nobody did any, like, this didn't take any effort at all, really. This is
it shows.
That's right. It shows.
It looks like garbage, right? There's nothing, it's kind of like the Skechers ad for Skechers shoes that was an AI generated ad that was in Vogue magazine, like within the last week or two.
Oh, okay.
The generated ad makes no fucking sense. It's like two women with like really skinny legs wearing high heels. And they had to just put like a picture of the shoe that they're actually selling in the corner of the ad. Rather than having it be the cornerstone of the fucking ad, it would have been so much cheaper for them just to do an ad where it was just a really nice photograph of the shoe on like a black background. That would have looked so much better than whatever garbage this AI slop that ended up becoming out, right?
Yeah.
And I think like had Mark Fisher lived long enough to see some of this coming, or seen it, because he saw it coming, some of it coming, but to see this AI generated bullshit that just looks terrible. And you have to go, this is the end result of capitalist realism. We're not even allowed to make art anymore. Like it has to be something put together and it's truly like a pastiche. But even in previous eras, if it was going to be like a hodgepodge of stuff, people still had to do it. They still had to think through it.
It took work.
And they don't even have to do that now with AI. Again, it's becoming more frictionless.
Yeah.
And as a result, it's crappier.
Yeah.
Like I think art suffers from things being easy and too easy. I think things should be hard. I think writing should be hard. I think writing music should be hard. Making a movie should be hard. And the reason it should be hard is because it's a process in which you put all of your heart, your soul, and your mind into, and you give everything to it. Right? Yeah. Do you think that I'm wearing my David Bowie shirt, my Aladdin Sane shirt. Like, you think David Bowie would have wanted somebody to make AI versions of his songs? No. I think he would have been deeply offended by that, as anybody should.
With the amount of work he had to put into those songs to get the sounds that he wanted and the effects that he wanted. So,
and nothing truly new comes out of AI, right? It's all just a reconglomeration of things that came before, but not even done by a person.
Yeah.
Not even put through the interesting filter of a living, breathing, feeling human being.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what makes it, I think, is awful. Just totally awful. And I can understand some of it. I know we've used some of it for the show, so this is going to make me a bit of a hypocrite. But at the same time, there's a huge difference between what we do for a thumbnail, which is fine, it's whatever, versus, but we still do the show. It's not it's not like we're AI bots doing the show, right?
That's right.
Spotify this year did with their Wrapped 2024. They did a thing where you could listen to an AI generated podcast about the shit that you listen to, which I thought was the most depressing thing on the planet. I was so again, this is what we talk. This is what we mean when we say everything is happening, but nothing changes.
Yeah.
And so the other thing is the sort of the performative nature of radical politics in our era, so he has a section in chapter 2 where he talks about the movie WALL-E, the Pixar movie, and about how that movie in many ways is a good example of sort of anti-capitalism packaged in a way that it can be marketable and can be sellable. He also uses the example of Live 8 as opposed to Live Aid. A lot of people know what Live Aid was, which was the concerts in 1985, Queen, and all that. But in 2005, in the 20th anniversary of Live Aid, they did something called Live 8, which was Live Aid, but in 8 different cities all around the world.
Okay.
And I watched it live. Okay. So at the time, I watched it live. I taped Green Day's set when they played Live 8 years ago. And so there's an example of this sort of performative activism where instead of sort of advocating for a specific policy, it's more of we've got to combat hunger. This isn't political. It's just the right thing to do. And it's not. And it becomes this really performative, superficial thing. And he talked about this idea of interpassivity, where a film like WALL-E, in Fisher's words, sort of performs our anti-capitalism for us, which allows us to consume with impunity. One of the things we often tell ourselves is that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, which is true.
Which is true.
But unfortunately, there's a form of interpassivity there in that we just sort of say, well, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism.
It's not an excuse to do nothing.
Yes. But people think it often is. And for me, I kind of wrote a note about this where I said, I feel like a lot of social media for the left performs the function of interpassivity. We can see the funny meme that confirms our anti-capitalism, perhaps shared on our pages, and then move about our day as normal. None of it gets us to stop dead in our tracks and actually change anything. So there's this sense in which we feel like we've done something when in reality we've not done anything at all.
Right.
And so that's part of the issue. Why it's so much harder to combat capitalist realism is because capitalism's propaganda, weirdly enough, is kind of a lack of it, in the sense that people accept the norms of capitalism as sort of natural and eternal.
Right.
When we think of something like Basic Economics, that book is a book of capitalist propaganda, right? That's what it serves to do.
Yeah.
But no one thinks of it that way.
Yeah.
Unless you're like that, right? Yeah. People just, it's an economics textbook.
Right.
But it's not like Paul Samuelson's, okay? It's not like the classic one you would get in school. There are no professors likely in mainstream universities, except for maybe Hillsdale or some shit, where it's a private college, that would have you read Basic Economics as your textbook for your course in economics, right? Almost no. And so
it's so bad.
And he talks about how protests have sort of formed what he calls a carnivalesque background noise, which I think is kind of true. Like if you think of Occupy, I think one of the challenges of Occupy was that Occupy really didn't have any demands. It was
Right.
it was sort of kind of loose. And I think in its looseness, it was ineffective in the sense that it wasn't calling for very specific things. And compare that to, say, like the Tea Party, which actually did call for very specific things, which was we wanted, to fund services for poor people.
Yeah.
But basically, like, there were very specific calls from the Tea Party movement. They elected people.
Yeah.
No one was elected to Congress from the Occupy movement. That just didn't happen, right?
Yeah. Not that would be a thing that they would have wanted anyway.
No. But I'm just saying, like,
Yeah.
in the sense that, the power of society is currently filtered through the state.
Yeah.
In order to deal with it in some fashion, you have to interact with the state. Now, that can be in the form of a protest, but it can also be in the form of like being elected to office and doing something with it, right? I can tell you that I always felt, and this is just my own limitations. So again, I'm just me. This is a sample of one, but I never really liked doing protests. I don't like it. Because it just feels like an elaborate performance, and then everybody goes home and nothing changes.
Yeah. Yeah, that was. I mean, I haven't been involved in a lot of them, honestly. Like I live in
I haven't either, but I've been in a
and
few.
And usually I was one of these people who found out about these things after the fact.
Yeah.
But I do see how, like, if you're getting permits and you're following rules that are, the state allows you to do this thing, and you all go home at the end of the day, and that's that. Like,
yeah.
So what did you really do? You just went to a gathering. It could have been a concert or a speaking engagement or like a conference, and it would have been the same, right?
Pretty much, in the sense that it will go there. There's a sense of catharsis. People feel connected, and then you go home.
Yeah.
And nothing really happens. I mean, to me, the futility of protesting, to a certain degree, really showed up for me during the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, which were some of the largest protests in American history, and absolutely nothing happened.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, a couple statues went down, and some Democrats wore some fucking kente cloth. But at the end of the day, the cop cities were still built.
Yeah.
Black people were still being killed by the cops. People in general are still being killed by the cops, especially black folks.
Yeah, police funding went up.
Police funding went up.
Yeah.
We had a President Biden who, in a State of the Union, said fund the police, not defund the police. Like, there's this and so what did we actually achieve? And it was like not much, because all of that energy went into protesting instead of what it kind of really should have gone into, which was building networks of power, where you build a system that's parallel to the state with the goal of undermining it. Like, that's how you do it, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that in capitalist realism, because we're now in what we call the post-Fordist era. So the Fordist era is one that's, highlighted by manufacturing, where people are in manufacturing jobs. Those are jobs that they'll often have their entire lives. They have good wages, good benefits. They likely belong to the union. That Fordist era of capitalism, where it's mass production and industrial capitalism, is kind of gone in America and in the sort of global core, the imperial core. And it's been replaced with post-Fordism, where words like flexibility and agility and disruption become the mainstay of basically people not having set jobs, people having multiple jobs at a given time, being independent contractors so they don't get health insurance, they don't get overtime pay, or they don't get workers' protections if they get hurt. They are often paid under the minimum wage, but it's because they're contractors. They don't necessarily have to be paid the minimum wage. That's like Uber drivers. And so this was all sold to people as like, oh, this is the new economy. This will be really good for you. It'll give you a sense of freedom. And what's interestingly enough is that Fisher sort of notes the point that this idea of building a society around this freedom actually creates a form of oppression, because people don't have anything solid to hold on to.
Yeah.
There's no social democratic safety net worthy of its name. There's no real job security. There's no, there are millions of Americans who are underinsured or uninsured in the healthcare industry.
Yeah.
You have all of these problems, and yet the problems are sold as if they're like good things.
Right.
And I think that's the part where language often is used to confuse and obscure rather than to illuminate, clarify. And that's a big part of it. And as he writes, ultimately, to really look at it for what it is, capital is an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker. But the living flesh it converts into dead labor is ours, and the zombies it makes are us. So, like, we are actively in the process of our own destruction in this system. And this quote of Fisher's very much echoes one of Marx's famous lines, which is that capital is dead labor, that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. Right. Yeah. So it's this. Vampires are a great example of like capitalists, because capitalists are parasites. I mean, generally these people are parasites. They live off of the labor of others, which I find very interesting when people can say, welfare people are parasites or immigrants are parasites. And like, most people who have welfare work for a living. One. Yeah. Two, most immigrants who come here also work for a living. They do the jobs that you don't want to do. And capitalism itself was built upon the forced labor of millions in slavery. So don't talk to me about who's lazy and who isn't.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's absurd to think that like people that are sitting up on piles of money because they invested a certain thing are working harder than the people who are basically building and running society at the base level. It's absurd.
That's why, I don't understand how Elon Musk can do all he does and also be the world's best Diablo player.
Right.
Like that makes no sense to me. He's either fucking off and that's what he's doing all day, or two, he's paid for that like he's paid for everything else.
Yeah.
It's probably the latter.
I talked to some guys at work and I said, so do you think that you could do 3 of this job? Because Elon Musk is apparently so hard a worker, he can be the CEO of 3 different companies. I couldn't do my job 3 times over. Like, it's just not a human thing that you can do.
No. The other thing I find fascinating is that when we talk about the problem of CEOs, we talk about the problem of like these sort of wealthy capitalists, we often we'll get the propaganda from people, and they don't even know it's propaganda. That's the part. Capitalism has done a very good job of propagandizing for itself without appearing like it's propaganda. Yeah. It's like what we say is like propaganda to people, right?
Yeah.
And to a certain extent it is. Like I acknowledge full well this is a educational / propaganda tool. Like I'm trying to get people to not be on the right. Like that's my explicit goal. I'm telling you exactly what I'm doing. I'm not bullshitting you. Okay. Yeah. That's the big difference between people like us and people like them, is that we'll be honest about our point of view. We'll be honest about what our opinion is. We're not going to hide it behind, corporate bullshit. And so when it comes to Musk, like this is a man who's the richest man on earth. And yet somehow it seems like genuinely like a moron. Like I don't get it, other than every time he opens his mouth, it just sounds like stupid shit. And so then you have to ask the question, how did we get here? And I think a lot of it just comes down to that idea that, well, there's really no alternative. This is the best we can do. And that's the capitalist realism element of it. That's how somebody like a ghoul like Musk can be worth that much money. And everybody just kind of goes, we're sort of resigned to it. In the 1960s, there was a sense in which the youth of America, and even the youth of the world, if you think of France in 68, there was a sense in which there was a real defiant rage that existed, and people legitimately resisted it. They actively fought against the system in a way that they don't do now. And part of that is because people are so fucking tired. People are so tired. And so it's very hard to build solidarity when the labor movement is weak, when social clubs are gone, when we are mediating almost every moment of our fucking lives with these fuckers. Like,
right.
There's this sense in which we're no longer connecting with human beings, and we're connecting with this abstract system that fits over us.
Yeah.
And it's easy to say it's capitalism because it is, but it's also capitalist realism.
Yeah.
This is that pervading force that just filters through everything else and kind of undermines everything.
Yeah.
And I think this might be a good place to stop if we have like comments, questions.
Well, there's been a variety of comments. Kerrigan Hayes is watching. So hi, Kerrigan.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your wonderful recommendations. We will be doing liberal socialism in the new season, next year's season. We'll do Matt McManus's book. I don't know if we'll do the other book because I want to make sure that we do a variety of different books. We might do the Matt McManus one as like the main show, and then we may do the other one as like a Patreon one. Just a thought. But that one, and then like after a certain amount of time, we could just release it. But anyway, yeah. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, there's a variety of other comments. Some are worth looking at, some aren't. So we're just
okay.
Nothing I'm going to bring up.
That's fair because like there's just so much good here that I don't really. No disrespect to our wonderful viewers, but I don't want to. Not that we would get derailed by the comments, but I want to try to cover as much as we can.
Yeah.
So we talk about this sense of impotence, right? And that's that word is in the title of chapter 4, and he talks about sort of parlaying these experiences of seeing what capitalist realism does to people through the lens of higher education. Because he was a lecturer, he was a college professor, he earned a PhD. So he was in the academic system and sort of went through it and was a part of it, but also went against the grain of it and at some point left it. But we talk about how there's really two parts of this chapter that I think are really fascinating. One of them is this idea of sort of depressive hedonism. So traditionally, we've often considered depression as a state of anhedonia, meaning that you don't derive pleasure from anything.
Okay.
And in capitalist realism, that's kind of inverted, where as Fisher writes, it's not an inability to get pleasure so much as it is an inability to do anything else except pursue pleasure. Where pleasure happens, that's the main thing that we're going to do, simply by virtue of the world is just too hard to be a part of. So, depressive hedonism is absolutely real. We have all done it.
Yeah.
Instead of working on something productive and fulfilling, we often just fuck off to dull the pain of everyday life.
Yeah.
Right. And that can take watch a movie,
Yeah.
I mean, this goes in many different ways. It's like watch a movie, watch a TV show, smoke some pot,
go get drunk,
masturbate. Like there's all these different things that you can do that provide you with that temporary pleasure to numb you from how hard the world is around you.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
And because the world is a dark and pointy and a sharp-edged place in a lot of ways. It can also be good and beautiful. But it's harder and harder to see the beauty and the joy and have a sense of exuberance when you live under capitalist realism, when you're trying to, just to keep a roof over your head and food on the table, especially if you have children, if you have multiple jobs, if you're working in the temporary economy, sort of the gig economy, where you're sort of a nameless, faceless drone that anybody can pull up on an app. And I think this idea of depressive hedonism has become even worse since Fisher's time. He wrote this book in 2009, right? So it's like right at the very beginning of social media being everywhere and being such a pervasive aspect of our lives.
Right.
The iPhone was 2 years old when he wrote this book.
Wow.
And so when you think about it that way, it makes you realize, oh my God. There's a lecture that he gave in 2010 or 2011 where he talks about how smartphones have taken things where we have so much like anticipation and like anxiety about the notifications we get for something that's fundamentally boring. So he talks about how in the past, you could have this like anxiety and anticipation for something exciting.
Right.
Like when you were a kid, like I will never forget as a kid, I had to have been 11 at the time and going to the movie theater with my family to watch some other movie, but seeing the first poster, like the teaser poster for Sam Raimi's Spider-Man.
Oh yeah.
And like just seeing that poster, like blew my fucking mind. Like I was just like, it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen.
Yeah.
And I was like so excited about it. And so I had to wait for like 8 months to go see that movie. But there's this anticipation of something worthwhile in the sense like it's a good movie. Spider-Man's one of the classic superhero movies, classic movies. Sam Raimi's a genius, you know? And it made me really love him as a filmmaker. And then I went back and watched the Evil Dead movies, and those are amazing. Like it's a sense of anticipation for something fun and exciting and rewarding, ultimately rewarding. With our phones, it's not that at all.
No.
We get the buzz, we get the ping, and we get that anticipation or that anxiety of seeing something. But fundamentally, it's probably just a text message saying, I'm going to be home 15 minutes late, babe. Sorry.
Somebody
or it's
liked
like the
your
email
post, or some troll commented on your fucking
someone liked your post on Instagram, or somebody left a fucking comment on your Facebook page or whatever.
It's nothing.
And it's nothing. We get so excited for nothing. And I think that's really, really sad. And I think that's part of the reason why there are certain things I do with social media that help me keep sane. One of them is that I'm not really on Facebook anymore, but one thing that I have is called Newsfeed Eradicator. So when you pull up Facebook, when I pull up Facebook, the feed is just not there. If I have to see something, I have to go to somebody's page to look at it instead of going through the feed.
Oh.
I also have my notifications shut off on my phone for social media apps. So I only get notifications if I'm looking in the app. Right. Because you can't shut those off.
Yeah.
Like you can't like and they design these, right? Like they've talked about how people who worked on social media apps are people who also worked on like online gambling. Like it's a slot machine. Every time you pull it, you get that little dopamine hit.
Yeah. But
for something that's like fundamentally not interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's not even as interesting as fucking online gambling. Like it's
not even interesting in online, because even with gambling, there's the anticipation of something.
Yeah,
you might make money. There's no anticipation of anything when it comes to social media. There's nothing, and so I think that's really sad. I think that's really, really sad.
Yeah.
The other thing that's in this chapter that I find really fascinating too is that he has a quote about this, and he talks about it in the specific context of his students. So it's like the consequence of being hooked into the entertainment matrix is twitchy, agitated interpassivity, an inability to concentrate or focus, students' incapacity to connect current lack of focus with future failure, their inability to synthesize time into any coherent narrative is symptomatic of more than mere demotivation. This isn't just the kids these days. Like, it's like, no, like this is fundamentally different than generations before. I am so glad that I got through all of high school and most of my college without a smartphone. Like, I'm so grateful for that. I think back on that now, and I'm so grateful because I don't know if I'd even have finished.
Right.
And in Indiana, they just passed policies with schools where you don't get to have your phone during the day at school. And I heard somebody say this on a podcast where they were like, what took you so long? If your parents needed to get in contact with you, they would call the school.
Yeah, call the school.
Call the school. And then the school would say, so-and-so to the principal's office. And you go down there and they said, your mom called for this, right? Yeah. That's how it worked for decades.
Or your mom just didn't get a hold of you during the day. You saw her after school.
Yes. And the only thing I used to think about of why I used to keep my phone by me at all times, the justification that I would give for many, many years was my grandmother is elderly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if something's going to happen with her. So I keep my phone close. But that didn't even serve me well, because in 2017, my grandmother had a heart attack. She was 82. She had a heart attack and she couldn't get a hold of my dad. And she didn't want to call me because I was at the office and I was in Indy and she didn't want to bother me with it.
Yeah.
So she drove herself to the doctor. You know what I mean?
It didn't matter. Yeah.
So it didn't matter.
Yeah.
And so, I did not get a smartphone until I was 23. And I highly recommend that for people. I don't think anyone should have a smartphone until they're 25.
Yeah.
I think that brain should just fully develop, and then they give you the phone. But then there's a part of me that's like, would that even make a difference? Because I can feel it. It's, sometimes it's like harder for me to pay attention to stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes longer books are harder to read. We all feel that because we're inundated with the shit and we can't escape it.
Yeah.
And
right.
and of course this is going to mess with kids. Of course this is going to mess with education. You gave people an entertainment thing in their pocket.
Yeah.
All the time. When I was a kid, you couldn't have a fucking portable CD player in class.
No, that's right.
You couldn't have a Game Boy in class.
Yeah.
Why should it be any different than the phones?
You had to leave your Walkman or your CD player in the in your locker or whatever.
Yes, you had to leave that shit in your locker.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, I had an old school Nokia phone. I used to have to do text messages with it by punching the different numbers multiple times to get the letters. Right?
Yeah.
I only had it because I was driving. My dad wanted me to have a phone on me in the case of an emergency. And through most of college, I had phones that were hand-me-downs. My friend James was a big tech head. He would get a new phone every year. And so most of my phones through high school, late high school and early college, through most of my college experience, were phones that he had just given to me. So I had a BlackBerry for a while. I had a Sidekick for a while. And the only things those things did were make phone calls and send text messages. And that was fucking it. Yeah. That's all they did. And I go back and forth on this because there was a period of my life about 6 years ago where I quit social media. I was off for 6 months. It was one of the best times of my life. I think about it now and I realize how truly, truly unimportant and uninteresting social media is.
Yeah. And
yet I cannot leave it. That's the part. It's so much harder to leave.
Fuck.
So much harder to leave. Yeah. And so, The other thing he says that's interesting is he quotes the theorists Deleuze and Guattari talking about how capitalism is profoundly illiterate. Writing has never been capitalism's thing. That's true. Most Americans don't even read books anymore, including elite college students. There was an article that just came about how the elite college students who can't read books.
Really?
Kids who get into Harvard, Yale, Princeton. And it's because of standardized testing. They know how to read excerpts of things and to take tests based on those excerpts, but they don't know how to read a book. And this is the kind of...
Yeah, I was just talking to my counselor about this actually today. It was for workers, when we do have time to read, we've often been taught through propaganda or through a variety of other things that reading is something that the elites do. They don't know how the world works because they spend all their time reading books. And we're the ones that are running the world. We know how it works, but we don't read because we're dealing with real world stuff.
Right. And there used to be a time where the working class did both.
Yeah.
Where, and part of that is that, another book that I read this year that I think is also required reading. I think it's a book that builds, it's something that the capitalist realism is a good accompaniment to. It was kind of capitalist realism for the 80s. And it's a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. Okay. And that book is about television. It's mostly about television and talking about how we're seeing the death of a print literate culture. And now most people's information is mediated to them through moving pictures on screens rather than through text, and how that fundamentally changes the way that people think and how they interact with the world. I did a post recently about movies on my Threads account, and I said something along the lines of, part of the problem in America is that Americans are profoundly illiterate. Most Americans don't read books, let alone novels. Right. And so they don't get irony, they don't get satire, they don't get metaphor very well.
Yeah.
And so I call it the sort of the CinemaSins effect, where people watch a movie and all they can do is go, well, that doesn't make sense. And that doesn't make sense. What about this? Instead of watching the movie and enjoying it and trying to figure out what is the artist trying to say to you about something, right? The example I go back to is Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises, the last of his Batman movies.
Right.
And the constant question that everybody will always fucking ask is, how does he get back in the city? And it's man, and I'm going to tell you this right now. The answer to that question is, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The answer to that question is, it doesn't matter. The movie is about a man who has become the sacrificial lamb, right? Because in The Dark Knight, Harvey Dent is the villain. He's the one who ultimately kills certain people and does those terrible things. The Joker kind of pushes him to that. But Batman and Commissioner Gordon are like, no, he's the symbol. Like, he's the hero that the city needs to be better. So let's hide the fact that he went nuts.
Yeah.
Let's hide it. And so they push the blame onto Batman rather than it being on him. And so Batman goes away for a while, and then he comes back in The Dark Knight Rises, right? And then Bane like kicks his ass and breaks his back, and then he ends up in this fucking prison in like the middle of nowhere. And the movie's all about, birth, death, rebirth, resurrection, rises. He rises. He literally rises in the movie. He rises out of the fucking hole, right? And that's what that's trying to convey to you. And so if your first thought is, well, how did he get back in the city? If that's like your first thought, you're a fucking geek. And you fundamentally miss the point. Like, you have fundamentally missed the point, which is that it doesn't fucking matter. He's Bruce Wayne. He's that fucking good.
That's right. He's fucking Batman.
He's fucking Batman. Like, of course he's going to know how to get back into the city, dude. Jesus Christ. Right. It just blows my fucking mind. Like, how they're like, well, how did you get back in the city with no money? It's like, well, he left Gotham City and ended up in like fucking China with no money in the first movie.
Here's the thing about stories. Sometimes they don't make sense the way you expect the world to make literal 100% scientifically founded, perfect sense.
Exactly.
They're stories to tell you something, a lesson in some way.
Exactly. And capitalist realism, to tie it back to Fisher, kills that. It kills subtext.
Right.
So the only thing people have is the text. And it makes them hyper literal. It's interesting. We live in an era, in a world where people are both hyper literal and deeply illiterate at the same time. Yeah. And we all are. Have I read all of the works of Shakespeare? No. Have I read Ulysses by James Joyce? Like, no. Like, I'm illiterate in many, many ways. We all are. But the difference is that the mark of an educated person is knowing that you're ignorant a lot of things.
Right.
The true mark of the cocky dumbass is that he doesn't know what he doesn't know, and so he doesn't give a shit, right?
Thinks he knows everything.
Because he thinks he knows everything, he can sort of pass it off as if he knows anything. And because we live in an era where people say shit like, my truth, which is a phrase that I go back and forth on about how I feel. Like, like when these people say my truth, like, oh, that's like their interpersonal experience. Sure. That's their emotional truth. That's fine. But I'm sorry, but like 2 + 2 = 4 and the world's fucking round. Like, there are certain things that are just not truths to you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And part of the postmodernist turn in capitalist realism is denying basic facts about reality.
Yeah.
While at the same time accepting realities that are sort of tailored to you.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a real problem. Another key part of the book, to kind of transition into another thought here, is we talk about, we talked in the preface of the episode about how Fisher wrote a lot about mental health and his own mental health struggles and all that. One of the things he talks a lot about is how in capitalist realism, the problems of mental illness are shoved onto individuals, and the social causes of those mental illnesses or mental problems are not addressed or are not even discussed. Yeah. So he talks about how he says, like, the ruling ontology just is a word for being. So like the current ruling view of the world denies any possibility of a social causation of mental illness. The chemico-biologization of mental illness is, of course, strictly commensurate with its depoliticization.
Yeah, yeah. You're depressed not because of society and the state of the world. You're depressed because of chemicals in your brain.
Bingo. Considering mental illness an individual chemical biological problem has enormous benefits for capitalism.
Yep.
So the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I also want to talk about our old favorite, Christopher Lasch. So Christopher Lasch said the same shit 30 years before this in The Culture of Narcissism and the Minimal Self. So that's not to say that Mark Fisher's aping him or anything. It's that they're on the same wavelength, which is that social problems require social solutions. But in capitalist realism, there is no such thing as a social problem. There are only individual problems that are solved by individual solutions. And if you can't solve them, it's on you. It's your fault. That's how it works in the current. And so I think what's really interesting is, I have depression. Like, I live with depression. I take medication for it. Do I think some of it is a chemical imbalance of the brain? Oh yeah, I do. In the sense that like my father has depression, right? And also takes antidepressants, but didn't take them until he was in his 40s.
Right.
But at the same time, do I think that I take antidepressants to kind of numb me a little bit so that I can survive living in capitalism? Yes, I think I do. I think if we lived in a healthier world, I may not have to take them.
Right. Yeah, because there'd be other ways to cope with the feelings of that come with depression, right?
Yes, because I'll tell you what right now, the thing about antidepressants, they're cheap. They're very cheap. I take Lexapro. I've been taking Lexapro for 11 years.
Okay.
Escitalopram is the generic of Lexapro. And it costs me to get like a 90-day supply. It costs me like $15.
Oh, geez. Wow.
So it's dirt cheap.
That is cheap. Wow.
There's another medicine I take that helps. It's also an antidepressant. It's with Lexapro or escitalopram is what's called an SSRI. It's a serotonin reuptake inhibitor.
Yeah.
It's the most common form. That's what Prozac is.
Yeah.
But then there are older antidepressants. They're called tricyclics. They do something different.
Okay.
I take one of those too. It's called amitriptyline. And the reason I take that one is I don't actually take it for depression. I take it for nerve pain because I deal with chronic pain in my head and my neck. And so it helps with nerve issues. And so people will take it. It also just has the added benefit that I take 2 antidepressants every day. So do I have genuinely bad days? Yeah. Up until recording this podcast today was pretty shitty for me.
Right.
But do I have a full meltdown because it's bad? No. And I tried getting off of antidepressants 2 years ago and I couldn't do it. I had pretty much I had a mental breakdown in the summer of 2022. And that's why I quit doing the show for a while, because I had to work through that.
Yeah.
So I had to go back on the medications because they helped me. They also help with anxiety, because I have a lot of anxiety too and triggers, and I've had panic attacks and things like that. And Fisher's written all about this, and this spoke to me a lot when I was reading it, because it's like, oh my God, he's gone through the same shit I've gone through.
Right.
Where it feels like no one understands what you feel, or no one understands the pain that you go through. And I think one of the biggest lies that have been told to us is this idea that depression is just this thing that's just your brain's wrong. And so we're going to give you these medicines to make you feel better. Now, does that help? Yes. I can tell you my life has been made better by antidepressants. No question. Having said that, though, that is not all of it. And that I think there are probably a lot of people who take anti-anxiety or antidepressant medications that may not need them.
Right.
And maybe there was a time in my life where I didn't need them either. And it's because we no longer think of these things as social problems. We just say, well, this is how it is. Yeah. Just accept how it is and move on.
Yeah. Take your drugs and and live in the society as it is. Don't worry about fixing anything. Don't worry about all the shit that's downstream, all the catastrophe, all the other stuff.
Yeah. There's a very famous clip of Fisher talking about depression and culture that's on YouTube, where he's talking about Drake. And he talks about what makes Drake sort of emblematic of the era in which we live in, the last couple of decades, is that his music, a lot of music of previous generations was fueled by, say, cocaine.
Right.
Where, it was kind of frenetic and loud and energetic. How would you describe Drake's music? Right?
I would describe it as boring.
Bingo, right? It's
not everybody agrees with me. But
as John Carpenter often described soundtracks, it's musical wallpaper.
Yeah.
I think that's what Drake's music is. It's boring and it's mellow because it's made by an artist who's constantly on downers.
Yeah.
We live in an era now where people are on uppers, but they're on downers. They're a generation or two ago, they wanted to take cocaine, or they wanted to take Quaaludes and shit. They wanted to fly high, or poppers, right? Anything that could get you going wild and feel that sort of sense of manic energy. But now most people they're not doing that, but they're on antidepressants. So everything's kind of mellow.
A lot of us came down off of those things, and now and now we can't get back up there. So
we can't get back up. And we don't want to go any lower. We don't want to go down any further. So we're going to,
We just
and so I think that's a really great way to describe Drake. And I think he's kind of emblematic of the era.
Yeah.
where there's a lot of pop music that's just deeply, deeply boring because there's no energy to it. It's all just kind of like blah. And that's how I would describe Drake. And I think that's how he did too. But that's the thing, is that he talks about how he describes it as like, if he basically says, like, if depression is really about low serotonin levels, then we have to start asking the question, well, what causes that then?
Right. Yeah.
Is it simply genetic or is it social? And I would say it's probably a little bit of both, maybe a little more on the social, right? Yeah. And he says, in order to do that, it requires a social and political explanation.
Yeah.
And the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one if the left wants to challenge capitalist realism. I agree with this 1,000%. Yeah. I would also broaden this out, okay? And we talked about this in our health communism episode. There's a new book out by Verso about autism.
Okay.
It's talking about neurodivergence in a general.
Okay.
Neurodivergence and disability in general. Like, we have to make a good argument for it, and how neurodivergence and disabilities can often be caused by social processes, and that they should be solved via social processes of solidarity and care. And so I think that's right. I think repoliticizing mental illness is a huge way forward. I think, to me, it's a huge way forward.
There's, not to plug another podcast, but there's a great podcast called It's Not All in Your Head, where they talk about mental health and and society and capitalism and all the shit that's on us as people.
That's cool. No, that's really, really cool. It kind of sounds like what Tech Won't Save Us does, but for mental health stuff.
Yeah.
I really love shows that sort of sift through the bullshit to get to the heart of what's really going on. I think that Citations Needed does that well too. There's a lot of really good podcasts that do that, including ours.
Including ours.
Not to toot my own horn too bad.
Yeah.
We're getting up close to the 90-minute mark. There's a couple other things I'd like to talk about. The one other big idea that I got out of this book that I really, really liked was this idea of market Stalinism.
Okay.
This is chapter 6 is about market Stalinism, and he talks about how we live in an era where neoliberalism was sold to us as, we're getting the state off your back, we're cutting the red tape, we're getting rid of the regulations, we're getting rid of bureaucracy, all these unelected bureaucrats making decisions, right? We're hearing this stuff again now with this whole Department of Government Efficiency that Elon Musk wants to do, right? I love that an unelected bureaucrat is going to talk about how we need fewer unelected bureaucrats.
Yeah.
But anyway, what is market Stalinism is basically saying that more time and effort goes into creating documentation and policy that purports to show progress,
right,
without actually making progress. And that was very common in the Soviet Union, where they would talk about the 5-year plans, where Stalin gave one speech, is dizzy with success, right? Where they would sort of say these big things about all these achievements, some of which were very real,
right? But
then other ones weren't. And there was a big disconnect between what the government would often say and what was actually going on. And so in especially the late Soviet Union, and I highly recommend people check out the book Autopsy for an Empire by Dmitry Volkogonov, who was a former Soviet historian who went through the Soviet archives after the end of the Soviet Union and really did excellent research on the history. But he talks about how, especially in the late Soviet period, that the Soviet populace just didn't believe what was told to them. There would be the official version, and then there would be the real version.
Yeah.
And what capitalist realism sells to us is this idea of, well, that dichotomy is going away. No, if anything, it's worse in the sense that what market Stalinism does is it keeps all of the terrible things that sucked about the Soviet Union, whether it's that centralization of control, lack of democratic oversight, crippling authoritarianism and propaganda and like sort of deliberate miseducation or deliberate obfuscation of reality. So it takes all of those things, keeps all of that, while at the same time using all of those terrible things to buttress capitalism. So it's like it's the worst. It's like the worst of all possible worlds in the sense that you get all the horrible shit from capitalism. You get all the horrible shit of state socialism or state capitalism under the Soviet Union.
Right.
And I think what's interesting to me is that as I kind of wrote, like the signifier means more than the signified. So what I mean by that is basically like signifiers are words.
Right.
And the signified is what we are describing with words. And in market Stalinism and in Stalinism or general, in any kind of authoritarian project, the signifier means more than what's being signified. And it's propped up over the signified.
Yeah.
And that's true in totalitarian systems. As I wrote, at least under Stalinism, there was real economic development, the rise of living standards. Neoliberalism can't even claim that. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
He also talks about how PR is a huge component of that and how there's often a huge disconnect between what actually happens versus what they say it does.
The spin.
So, yeah. So he writes, like, the way value is generated on the stock exchange depends, of course, less on what a company really does and more on perceptions of and beliefs about its future performance.
Yep.
And in my notes, I read about how this is Tesla.
Yep.
Tesla's like the emblematic example of this.
Yep.
Tesla accounts, I think, for less than 1% of all cars in the United States. Like there's 2 million Teslas on the road, but there's like 173 million cars in America.
Yeah.
So they account for less than 1% of the cars that are actually on the road. And yet they're the most valuable car company in the world.
Yeah.
Why is that?
It's all hype. Yeah.
It's all hype, right? There's the stock market's just vibes, bro. Like, a lot of it is just vibes.
Yeah.
They'll dress it up in fancy language, but it's vibes. Someone once described it as, the stock market is basically horoscopes for assholes, which I think is a good way to describe it. And so he sort of gets into a little bit of like Lacanian psychoanalysis here, where he talks about the idea of the big other. We won't go into that too much. We'll probably do that kind of stuff when we do Zizek in a later episode. But the big thing to get away from that is that basically we subordinate reality to this other that's outside of us. So it's kind of the saying we were talking in the pregame about, like, well, I'm sorry, but that's how the form has to be filled out.
Right.
Sorry.
Right.
Like I'm just following policy, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm just following orders, right? We're following this big other. But the problem with capitalist realism is there really isn't much of an other to glorify.
Yeah.
In great modernist political projects, whether they were good ones or bad ones, they had something to sort of achieve, something to get towards.
Right.
Capitalism doesn't have any of that. It doesn't have an endpoint.
No, that's right. It's just the never-ending growth of profit. It's just
it doesn't have an end goal in the way that other ones do. And what's interesting is that people often make the argument that the fact that it doesn't have an end goal is a good thing. Because look at other ideologies that have an end goal and see how bad they've been for people. And it's like, well, okay, but at least there was an end goal there. There was something to achieve. Yeah. Whereas under capitalism, what is there to achieve? I mean, other than just making a few people really rich.
Really rich. Exactly. That seems like a pretty, I don't know, not a good reason to keep going on it.
And so, I think to kind of get us moving towards the end here, I want to talk a little bit about the problem of like nostalgia. And that kind of fits into the later part of the book where he talks about how, the idea of nostalgia itself. And we live kind of in two worlds where we have, as he says, like a culture that is pretty much like about the present. Everything's about the now. It's the immediate. But at the same time, we have this yearning to go into the past.
Yeah.
So we have this like fetish for the present and this obsession with the past. And what's left out of that equation? The future. So if you're only focusing on the present or you're obsessing about the past, you're not conceptualizing the future anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think that can be really, really pernicious to us. And so and so he says, like, it wouldn't be surprising if profound social and economic instability resulted in a craving for familiar culture forms to which we return in the same way that born reverts to his core reflexes. He's referring to the Bourne Identity films where Jason Bourne's a man who doesn't know who he is, but then he realizes that he's like a spy and he has all these like special skills that he didn't know he had. And they sort of kick in like a reflex. But that idea of like a craving for familiar cultural forms in times of insecurity.
Right.
I think that's really inherent there.
Yeah,
right?
like nostalgia, right?
And that's the part that's fascinating is like in more stable political and economic times, we can often create more vibrant art. So for example, he talks in the other book, Ghost of My Life, he talks about the BBC Stereophonic Workshop, which was this really interesting experiment in art that was done through the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. And, probably the Stereophonic Workshop's greatest legacy is probably the theme for Doctor Who.
Nice.
Which they did. All of those weird electronic sounds and all that stuff of the original theme, that was all done by the Stereophonic Workshop. Years before there were sort of digital keyboards, they came up with a lot of that. It's hard to imagine that existing in Britain today. And like Keir Starmer's sort of hyper neoliberal project, like it's very hard to imagine something that interesting being done by the government. And so the flip of it is that basically, in extremely volatile times, we sort of go back to familiar forms. So as I write my notes, like nostalgia to me is inherently conservative.
Yeah.
It's not progressive. It's, because a progressive view of the world is one in which you imagine a different future, in which you actively try to create a conception of what the future might be that is in direct contradistinction to the past, that's different from the past. And so I think because of the era we live in, nostalgia does really well. I wrote, to me, it's no surprise that the logical conclusion after a decade and a half of nonstop superhero movies was the election of Donald Trump, a man who is as larger than life as Captain America. It's like, yeah, I think people wanted that sort of loud, sort of hero figure.
Yeah, the boisterous, strong man.
The boisterous, strong man to take care of you, right? And I'm going to tell you what, and I know this may make people uncomfortable, that was also the appeal of Obama.
Right.
But instead of Obama, it was more of the calm, reassuring hand, Like Obama was like the calm, reassuring dad who would make sure things were okay, and you would make sure that, you'd be taken care of.
And he had that soothing voice too.
Soothing voice.
That's right.
And calm and educated and had his sense of empathy, even though that was probably misplaced. And with Trump, he's more like the weird fucking uncle that you see on random holidays that gave you your first condom and kind of told you what it's like to be on Quaaludes. Like he's more like that, where it's this kind of pernicious influence in that he doesn't allow you to, he doesn't give you a sense of stability. There's no sense of making things feel right. Yeah. And we live in that era now where it is marked by by instability rather. And I think as a result, I don't think it's a surprise that, there are many different new iterations of Star Wars. There are new and different iterations of Star Trek. There's new versions of all kinds of different things, right? There's not only a sequel to Moana, but they're not just making a sequel to Moana, but they're making a live action and they're coming out around the same time. So now we're getting nostalgic about things that just happened merely a few years ago.
Right.
There's the new poster for the new Superman movie dropped today. And the time between Henry Cavill's Superman starting and David Cornsweet's Superman starting is 12 years. It's not a lot. It's not a lot of time.
Right.
And it feels like it's kind of accelerated. And as a result, really, we are left in a place where culture doesn't really change all that much. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the post game when we talk about the slow cancellation of the future.
Cool.
I just want to finish up with some final thoughts.
Okay.
Basically, I think that Capitalist Realism is probably one of the most important books of the last 20 years. I think that it is absolutely essential reading. So, read it. It's online for free. If you type in Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher PDF, you'll get it.
Yeah.
I think on maybe the LibCom website, you can read it for free.
Probably.
Um, and you can also, I'm pretty sure that you did the audiobook. So there's an audiobook that exists. Like, it is important. I think it's one of those books that, if it's a must read for you to get a sense of where you are, because it will give you a grounding and a really great start in thinking about things. Because from Fisher, I got into Zizek, and from Zizek, I got into like reading, like older, like Hegel or Marx, like
Right.
you do that kind of genealogy. But I want to leave with one quote, and I think that it's really good, and I think it sums up what's especially something that's happened within the last couple of weeks. So he ends the book with saying, the tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction, which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. And I think that is true. And I would also say, I think that very much speaks to the moment we're in now, especially after the killing of the United Healthcare CEO. It was a moment of catharsis for America's working class, where it didn't matter if you were Democrat or Republican, black or white. Everybody hates health insurance companies.
Yep.
And there was a sense of people really were not bothered by the fact that it happened. And it's been very interesting to watch the media try to spin it to make you feel bad for the CEO, and that just not taking, which is, I think, a good thing. Like, I think it's generally a good thing. And so, I think that those are the things we have to look for in these dark times, are those little fissures, those little cracks in the wall that allow for a small beam of light that can eventually lead us to the promised land. Like there's a, I think that is there. And so I want to leave on a hopeful note, which is that I do think that we're going to be entering into some dark shit over the next few years. If we aren't there already, in many ways we are.
Yeah.
But the goal of the left is to not give in to it and completely resign yourself to it.
Right.
And to acknowledge a notion of hope, and to acknowledge a sense that things can be better if we fight for it, because that's the only thing that's ever worked. I could talk about this for another hour and a half. I absolutely adore Mark Fisher. It breaks my heart every day that he's not here, because I think he would have had a lot of really, really, really interesting things to say about the last 15 years.
For sure.
And it's just heartbreaking that he's no longer here. And in many ways, like so many, he's a casualty of the thing he wrote about, which is capitalism.
All right. So I guess we're going to take a little break from the main show.
Yes.
It's the holiday season.
Yes, it's the holidays. I need a break. But it's been a really great year. I just want to thank everybody for watching and for sending comments, and especially for our Patreon supporters. Thank you so much for your support. I feel like this has been our best year yet.
Yep.
And I'm really excited about going into 2025. We're not going to be gone forever. We're just going to be gone through the first part of the holidays. But we'll be back in January with the new season, and a fifth season. We're going into our fifth year of doing the show, which is like incredible.
Awesome.
It's been one of the most rewarding projects I've ever been a part of, and so I want to thank our audience. I want to thank our Patreon supporters, and I want to thank you, Corey, for making it all happen, because this was your great idea, nearly 5 years ago, to say, hey. You want to do something with me? And you want to do this kind of show? And I was like, yes, let's do it. I'm very grateful. You like books. Let's do something. So I love it. I love doing this show. I can have a terrible day and come in and do this show and feel good and really enjoy doing it. So again, I want to thank everybody. Corey especially, but I also want to thank some of our very special people, Kerrigan, Velkin 999, Nonsequently, Some Random Geek. Thank you so much. You're like our super supporter, and I really appreciate it. And thank you so much earlier this year setting up the election live stream. That was a good one.
Yeah, that was fun.
But yes, thanks to everybody who has been a part of this community. We are small and mighty, but we're no longer as small, and we're
That's
more
right.
mighty.
That's right.
So it's and so I'm very grateful, and I really look forward to 2025.
Yeah, and I think it's December 28th. We're doing a patron-only live stream again.
Yes,
So
we are.
if you're a patron, look forward to that. If you want to get in on that and ask questions, you can go to patreon.com/skepticalleftist. And I guess
Become a patron.
Become a patron. I guess
I will say,
I was
going to say too, for the Patreon stream for our supporters, obviously it's going to be a Q&A and we'll answer your questions. But I think one of the themes I'd like to talk about for that episode is just talking about, favorite reads of the year, talking about some of the other books that we don't do for the show that I really enjoyed. Maybe talk about some books or things that you've read and enjoyed. We can also talk about like movies we really like to watch, or talk about stuff we like to watch, stuff that wasn't that very good. I mean, I love talking movies. We might talk a little bit of movies, but I really going into 2025, I want the Patreon only streams and the post games to become a little bit more structured, to really provide even more interesting content.
Some real quality to the support.
Some really high quality content.
That's right. Not that we don't do high quality content after the show.
Exactly.
For sure. So I guess the only thing left is where can people find you?
So people can find me at justinclark.org. My website's right down there. That's where you can find all my writing. And my essay on Eric Fromm is still up there. Eric Fromm. I found out I was saying his name wrong forever. So correction. Eric Fromm in technology. I'm still working on my American Idiot retrospective. I keep thinking more and more about it, and it keeps getting more and more expansive in my mind. So we'll see how that goes. And then, the hope, I need to get back to writing more of my short reviews for social media, but you can follow me on social media at Justin Clark PH. PH stands for Public History. I'm on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. I'm mostly active on Instagram. And as always, please consider becoming a patron, patreon.com/skeptical leftist. That's where you'll get the pre-games, the post-games, Patreon-only episodes, and all kinds of exclusive content from us and from Corey. He's been doing really excellent interviews. The Matt McManus interview is great. I've been listening to some of the clips, and I look forward to listening to the whole episode, but I'm really excited about it because we're going to do his book in the new year. Cool. But yeah, you've been doing a lot of really great work. So definitely consider becoming a patron. I will say that, we'll be back in January. I have to figure out exactly what day we'll be coming back. Barring like illness or anything like that, knock on wood. We'll be back January 14th. Cool. And our first book of the new year will be The Declarations of Havana by Fidel Castro. We'll be talking about Cuba, which has been sort of requested for a while. We've talked about a lot of the other great sort of socialist projects of the 20th century. We'll talk about Cuba. This is a collection of his writings. We got a lot of really interesting stuff for 2025. We're going to talk about Christian nationalism. We're going to talk about liberal socialism. We're going to do some CLR James. I do have a Zizek on the schedule, so we're going to finally do Zizek on the show. All kinds of really fun stuff. And so, consider becoming a patron. And thank you again for all of your support, both patrons and non-patrons. We really sincerely appreciate you being a part of the community that we're building here.
For sure. All right. And with that, thanks everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you all. See you in 2025.
All right, folks, that's all for now. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me keep the power on. Thanks to my top patrons, Damian Marie at Hope, Some Random Geek, Justin Clark, Dan F. Smith, and Lisa Glass. And thank you to my new patrons. You can stay tuned for the list of patrons at the end to see your name listed. If you aren't a patron and want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send a one-time donation to buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. I also have a Substack where you can subscribe for free or you can donate per month. And lastly, you can get a paid subscription on Spotify that will give you the same access to bonus content and extra long episodes. If you can't contribute financially, then a like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes for links to all my stuff, or check out my link tree. It's linktr.ee/skepticalleftist. That's where you can find all my social media spaces and communities. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening or watching. Make sure to leave a comment on the video, join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda. Also, stick around for a clip from this episode's post-show chat.
Losing the future, but we're absolutely being suffocated by the past.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people are always like, how can you say that as an historian? And it's like, because I know the past. I learn about the past to inform my present so that we make better decisions in the future.
Which is how it's supposed to go.
That's the point. It's also fun. Like, I enjoy doing it, but at the same time, it has a purpose.
We don't just keep repeating the past over and over again. And it's like, do we really need another Ghostbusters movie? Like, do we need the fuck we do? Yeah.
Like, do we need another reboot of some other shit? Like, no, like, just let the past die. Let something new happen.